We're going to begin tonight. First of all, before we begin, I just have to say how incredibly honored I am to be on this stage and to share it with just such beautiful people. I mean, Norma, you are a professional singer, without any question. Rachel and Ryan and Shona all touched on things that I'm going to talk about too, which is that everything we're talking about here tonight is not new. Everything that we're touching on is ancient, and that we have a beautiful knowing inside of ourselves that has all of these answers, and these are not new ways of accessing this information. But before we go any further, we're going to start the way that I start every grief circle that I do. And we're going to start with just a 3-minute, I call it a current state of being. I'm going to play my sound bowls for 3 minutes. I invite every person here, if it feels comfortable to you, no pressure if it doesn't, but if it feels comfortable, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes and go within. I love how this container that we have all created here tonight has already created a safe space. Can you feel it? People have really shared from their hearts. It's just been such a gift to just even be here. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for putting this on. I just absolutely, McKaylin. So as we sit in this safe space, whenever I hold a grief circle, there are just a few guidelines. So before we close our eyes and we go within, what we're doing is we're just going to go within and we're just going to check in. We're just going to say, how am I in this moment? And as we do this, just remember that there is no right, wrong, good or bad. And there is nothing to fix. We are not broken. All we're doing is accessing information, okay? So we're going to take, we're actually just going to do 1 minute. So I will watch the time so that you can just close your eyes. Go ahead on the next inhale with your eyes closed. Allow yourself to go within. With that inhale, let that breath take you deep within and connect with your beautiful self. That space inside that is unique to only you. There's nobody else on this planet that has the exact same inner world that you have. And now, for 1 minute, I will play the bowls, and we'll just check in. As the bowls begin to fade, just start to come back to this room. Rejoin this safe space that we have created together. and bring that information that you just accessed back into this room. One of the most perplexing things for me that hit me several years ago is that there's one thing that is going to affect every single person in this room. It's going to affect every single person on this planet. And it doesn't matter what your circumstances are, where you live, how you live. And that thing is death. We're all going to die one day. And it is so crazy to me that we don't know how to talk about it. It's the one thing that we're all going to do. We all share death and grief, and there is no language around it. We've never been taught how to talk about it. In fact, oftentimes it's really shunned. This conversation is really taboo. And they kind of go together. Grief and death kind of go together. And so I feel really committed and really passionate about talking about this, about creating common language about death, about grief, and about how it affects us as human beings. Every one of us, every single one of us. I've been a death doula, a certified death doula since 2018, but really death came into my life a lot earlier, and people often ask me, how in the world did you decide to be a death doula? And in 2018, I was asked to go to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and present at a symposium for 400 medical school students. And one of the speakers said that we all have a death genesis. So it's where our relationship with death begins. And whether that is with a grandparent, whether that is with an animal, whether it's with someone, a friend, or some different situation, we all have a death genesis. When I was 16, my brother, who was 18, died in a car accident. And so that was my death genesis. And I didn't know what in the world to do with my grief, what in the world to do with death. Years later, my stepmom had osteoarthritis, and I saw her suffer for a lot of years. And I just kept thinking, in this day and age, why in the world would we suffer this way? Why don't we know how to help each other? And it was at that point that I discovered. So what is a death doula? A death doula, or an end-of-life doula, is known as a death midwife, is a trained non-medical professional who provides emotional, physical, and educational support for someone nearing death. They can be considered a mentor for the final chapter of life and are typically brought in by the family to help with the person who is dying. This is ancient. Back in thousands of years ago, this was a very common practice that one person would come and help other people, help them cross over, help them transition. And so that's the definition, in case you were wondering what death doula stands for. But the next slide that I want to show you, so this man his name is B.J. Miller. I discovered his TED Talk in 2015, and he talked about how really this skill for being okay with being with grief and death allows us to bring so much peace to each other, but that we have to know how to live with our own death. We have to know how to live with our own grief before we can ever show up and do this for somebody else. So he says, if we love such moments ferociously, then maybe we can learn to live well, not in spite of death, but because of death. And so the question is, how do we do this? How do we learn how to do this? So as I started to study about becoming an end-of-life doula, I discovered this next man. And I'm kind of obsessed with him. Any workshop I do, any classes that I teach, I always quote this man. His name is Francis Weller. He wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And this has become kind of a mantra for me, which is that the work of the mature person is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched large by them. And so that is the invitation. When I started doing end-of-life doula work, I showed up thinking that I was going to help other people, right? I was going to hold space for other people's grief, and I was going to help them transition to the other side. And I hadn't even begun to touch my own grief. And I'll tell you a quick story. I became a certified end-of-life doula, and I had never even sat with somebody at the end of life. And I was a certified death doula, but inside I was terrified of death. And so I signed up with a program up at the University Hospital. It's called NODA, which is No One Dies Alone. And it's volunteers who show up to sit with people who are actively dying. And the first night that I signed up, it was in the middle of the night because they would launch a 24-hour vigil, and all the volunteers would take 3-hour shifts. And my first shift was at 3 a.m. And I missed my alarm, and so I got to the hospital at 3:30 a.m. And this gentleman died at 3:15, and he died alone. And I was devastated because I felt like this was that he died on my watch. Fast forward to the next time that I signed up, and I got there right on time. Alarm went off. I wasn't going to miss it this time. Got there right on time. This other gentleman died 3 minutes before I got there. And I was like, what is going on? Like, why? I was, again, just completely devastated. And I had this really wise chaplain who sat with me as I just cried uncontrollably. And she said, Mindy, why are you crying? And I said, because this man died on my watch. And she said, his death didn't have anything to do with you. And the wisdom in that, and I know I just have a couple minutes left. I could talk about this for hours, but she taught me, this chaplain taught me that my sorrow and my heartbreak was really my own unprocessed grief. And so I spent the next several years really working on sitting with my own grief, doing a current state of being for myself every single day, and just asking, what grief do I have in me today that I need to sit with, that I can pull close and that I can hold close and allow to be a part of me so that I'm not so afraid of it? Because what I know is that there's no way that I can show up for you in your grief, or you in your grief, or you in your grief, unless I have shown up for my own first. This life is a grief practice. Grief doesn't always have to do with death. We deal with loss, we deal with suffering every single day. And if we know how to sit with our grief and truly befriend our grief, it truly does allow us to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and just stretch us wide open, and our heart just opens wide. And that has been my experience for the past several years in doing this work. And so if I can leave one thing with you tonight, it is the invitation to pull your grief in. To, first of all, just recognize it. Know that you're not broken if you feel sad or if you have deep, deep grief. It is part of the human experience, and the more we can accept that and pull that in, the more we can truly love our entire selves. That there's no part of us that needs to be pushed aside or rejected, that it all just gets to be part of who we are. And it's really life-changing. And then also to pull your relationship with your own death in closer. And in closing, I just want to read this. This was the third person that I discovered that I fell madly in love with, and his name is Frank Ostaseski. He wrote an incredible book called The 5 Invitations. This is kind of a long quote, but he said, "We cannot be truly alive without maintaining an awareness of death. Death is not waiting for us at the end of a long road. Death is always with us in the marrow of every passing moment. She is the secret teacher hiding in plain sight. She helps us to discover what matters most. And the good news is we don't have to wait until the end of our lives to realize the wisdom that death has to offer. Thank you so much.